So Patricia, or Pat Churchland, and Paul Churchland are philosophers at the University of California, San Diego. Pat is in fact chairman of the Department of Philosophy, or I suppose I should say chairperson. They work at the intersection of philosophy of mind and cognitive neuroscience, and they have a number of books that you may have heard of. Pat's most recent is Brain Wise, but in 1986 she did a book called Neurophilosophy, which basically established a subfield of the discipline. Paul has a number of books, but one of his most recent is The Engine of Reason, The Seat of the Soul, and I like to think of them as the first couple of philosophy, although there are obviously other married couples in philosophy, so perhaps I should say one of the first couples in philosophy. Let me just start with something that you wrote, Paul, at the beginning of the Engine of Reason, Seat of the Soul. You said, after 25 years of affection and collaboration with your wife, we often feel we've become the left and right hemispheres of a single brain. Who's left and who's right?
I'm not sure I've even addressed that question before, nor I think does it matter. I'm afraid we're both very verbal, so you're not going to be able to make one of us the left. I think maybe Pat's the left and I'm the right. But
what do you think?
Well, I do think Paul has greater spatial capacities than I do when he is constructing a project, building something, for example. I would have to do it all by drawing it out and having everything measured and so forth. He does it all in his head. And I find that something really almost incomprehensible to me. But, by the way, notice that that's actually a common pattern of gender differences between women and men, that lots of women like me don't have this rather richer spatial capacity for doing in your head these visual spatial constructions.
Now, I noticed actually that Paul's book has a toy in the back, a stereopticon, a gadget. And you're very much of a gadgeteer as well, aren't you?
Guilty.
Yeah, all right. So, on the other hand, I'm surprised to hear you say that, because my memory is that you grew up on a farm in Canada?
Well,
therefore being very practical,
yes,
and you would have to know left from right and your way around.
This is very true. And I did grow up on the farm, and it did mean that life was very practical, and that all of us farm children had to really rely on ourselves from a very young age, because there was nobody around to help you if you were off doing something and you had a problem, you had to solve it yourself. So in many ways, it was a life that was very practical and pragmatically oriented. The contrast with Paul really had to do with these visual-spatial, constructive kinds of things. But in other spatial things, like finding my way around, I'm okay.
You sell yourself short, dear. You're actually very good at these things.
Oh.
So, where did you grow up? I mean, you both grew up in Canada, so let's give a genesis.
I grew up with the wonderful example of a father who was an aircraftsman during the Second World War, who started a boatworks building business in Vancouver when I was in grade school. My basement or my backyard was always full of drills and planers and saws and metalworking stuff, and he ended up being, first of all, an industrial arts teacher in high school, and went back to school and university, got himself a degree, and became a high school science teacher. So those were the sorts of influences he had on me.
High school science teacher sounds like a good lead there. So did that what made you go into science? I mean, were you good at science as a kid at school?
Yes, my initial ambition was to be an engineer, in particular an aeronautical engineer, because I'd become besotted with all kinds of model airplanes, helicopters, you name it, as a child. And when I got to university, of course, it broadened. I wanted to go into physics, and as I started to learn physics, I wanted to know about the history of science, and when I got into the history of science, I was interested in the epistemology of science, and by stages I slowly tumbled off the physics bandwagon and into the philosophy cart, and have been there ever since.
Now, your parents were what? I mean,
Well,
Originally from Scotland or something?
No, not quite. They were both born in Canada, but they both grew up in the prairies, what you would call the Midwest. And they both grew up actually in sod huts, if you can imagine. Because sod huts. That is to say, there weren't trees, and so people constructed houses by cutting large pieces of sod and stacking them up. And both of them were on farms, and my father was avid in school, but his school only went to grade 6. So my father actually only had a grade 6 education, and by the time he was 12, he was sent, quite willingly actually, to be a printer's devil in a newspaper office in a small town on the prairies. And it was really as working as a printer's devil in a newspaper office that his education really expanded, and he learned to write, he read extensively, and of course he ended up being very good in the newspaper business.
So what does a printer's devil do?
Well, a printer's devil does the odd jobs. They sweep up the crud from the floor, they collect the old lead. This, of course, is not what happens now, but they collect the old lead from the type and melt it down, put it back into the linotype for reprocessing. They basically are sort of at everyone's beck and call.
So this was Mr. Smith's job?
That was his job.
Right, okay. So was there any science in your household? I mean, was your mother intrigued or...?
Well, there was science in the sense that if you're living on a farm and you're living in an out-of-the-way place, that you have to learn to do everything yourself. And my father was very good at that. And so, for example, we lived in a dry place where, in order for the trees to grow, you had to irrigate the trees, and the trees were, of course, fruit trees, and that's how we were supposed to be making a living. But in any case, so there was a creek that encircled the farm, and the problem was to get the water up out of the creek, up the hill, and to the trees. And so he built a water wheel and built a dam so that the water would come down, be caught in these little cans on the water wheel, come up to the top, dump out into a flume, and then he had this vast system of flumes. And he was also a bit of an inventor, so by the time that technology had progressed to a certain point, he invented a machine, a very simple machine in a way, for replacing a common hand ladder so that it would be machine driven, and it had a boom so that you could go up into the tree. And of course we see these all over the place now and call them cherry pickers. He wasn't, I think, the first. I think probably at about the same time all kinds of people were inventing them. So he was sort of a scientist by nature. And the funny thing, you would appreciate this actually, the funny thing was that he had read The Origin of Species. And had understood it. And so I grew up very much in the context of a biology that was not theologically underpinned, but that was underpinned by natural selection.
I think it's often forgotten that on the 24th of November 1859, when that book was published, 14 shillings, 1,250 copies, they sold out that day. It was a very popular book.
Yes.
You probably would have known that.
Well, it moved her father. He was a very, very clever man, made all sorts of things. And I think he was very glad to see me when I came along. He wasn't sure what was going to happen to his
Yes,
daughter.
I think probably he
Well,
was.
he probably thought you'd be an extra pair of hands to do all the projects. So, how did you get the inclination to even go to university? I mean, because I assume that this was the first generation of your family?
Oh, very much so. My mother was not unlike my father in her education. That is, she only had grade 8. But at that time, it was possible to train for a nurse, even though you hadn't graduated from school.